Jimmy Carter, not a Mason.
Not a Mason.
But there are some surprising Masonic connections to former President Carter. Let's talk about them. Welcome to the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry channel. I'm Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree, your host, along with historian and author, and my buddy, my pal. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Chris Ruli, 32nd degree, KCCH.
Hello, hello.
Before we go any further, subscribe, thumbs up, all that great YouTube stuff. It really does help us out, especially if you're a brother. Make sure you leave a comment below. Let's first, sad news over the holiday that Jimmy Carter passed away, age 100, the longest living former president, and served the country for many, many years, even after his presidency, Naval Academy graduate. But one thing that he was not, he was definitely not a Mason. And there was a lot of stuff online that said, oh, farewell, brother Carter, not a Mason.
Not a Mason. His dad was a Mason, but he was involved with the Masons. You can't say that he wasn't involved. He met Masons at the White House. There's a great photograph, of course, of him being made an honorary shrine ambassador, or not a Shriner, even though he had the fez and the, but he was just made an ambassador. So yeah, he's had a couple run-ins with the Masons.
So connections to Masonry, not a Mason himself. And there are a lot of presidents that fall into that. Many presidents greeted Masons at the White House. I mean, JFK, Lincoln, a lot of different presidents did that. Carter, the same, but not a Mason himself.
Right.
However, even in his funeral, we have a handful of things that connect to the Masonic fraternity. And I know one that you talk about, and we've talked about before, is as he's lying in state, the catafalque that he's on. So talk about what a catafalque is, because it's not a word you hear very often, and what its connection to Masons is.
Well, the catafalque is there's the coffin, and then it gets placed on a rig, and that's basically this place where the casket is placed. And so that specific rig that we're talking about, the catafalque, was built by a lieutenant grand commander of the Scottish Rite. His name is Benjamin B. French. He was one of the most active Freemasons in the country, period, full stop. He was a past Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He was a Grand Master of DC for like 7 or 8 years, if you can imagine. He was a Lieutenant Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction. He was the Commissioner of Public Buildings in DC. So he was in charge of Lincoln's funeral. And if you look at old newspapers, he was in charge of arranging the funeral, figuring out who will be in the procession. His son actually helped build the black catafalque with the trimmings and the adornments that you see. And so after Lincoln's funeral, they took that and they basically preserved it, and they've used it for other presidents.
So if they're having a funeral where somebody lays in state at the Capitol, they're using that catafalque
yes,
in
they're
most
using
cases.
the same one. And in fact, when it's not there, they move it to the Capitol Visitors Center, and they've used it a couple different times. So you can go see it at the Capitol Visitors Center when it's not being used in state.
So when Carter's casket leaves the Capitol Rotunda, and there will be a procession to the National Cathedral, which in and of itself has several different Masonic connections.
There's a lot of connections between Masonic activities that happen at the cathedral. And one of these things was when the cathedral is being built, the Bishop Harding, who was basically in charge of the cathedral or getting it set up and built, one of the things he wanted to do was, he was a Mason, and he wanted to bring in a lot of Masonic sort of influence, or Masons around the country to help contribute to the construction. And so the Sovereign Grand Commander John Coles of the Southern Jurisdiction
was laid to rest 30 feet from where we're standing.
Yeah, that's true. He was a part of a committee to basically organize a fundraiser across the country to help bring stones, bring all these things to the National Cathedral. A couple of years later, they fundraised to build a statue, I think that's the statue you're talking about, of George Washington, of the cathedral. There is a Masonic square. It's a space just for Masons. It shows George Washington, not in a Masonic, but in his, sort of Continental Army outfit. But at the top of behind the statue, you'll see 3 Masonic emblems. So there's certainly a lot of Masonic connection to the cathedral.
The cornerstone there was laid using Washington's gavel that he used, the Capitol cornerstone.
Teddy Roosevelt laid the cornerstone for I believe it was the foundation stone of the building, and then later on, a Blue Lodge in D.C. came in and also did another stone ceremony later on for one of the sort of big pillars in the memorial.
Now, the Tinfoil Hat Society out there, and we know you're watching, they're going to look at all these things and say, well, see, Masons are influencing the presidency again and all this.
As we said before, Carter was not a Mason. His dad was a Mason. One of the things that I really liked talking about it, and one of the things, actually a great example with President Carter, is you didn't have to be a Mason to be associated with the Masons. There are ways to engage with the Masons. There are ways that you can contribute. And so I think Carter is a great example of a guy who was not a Mason, but recognized the fraternity, recognized the things that the fraternity was doing, all the things that they were doing towards, charities and benefit societies. And so I think he is an example of someone who Masons should consider, a great friend of the fraternity.
That's Chris Ruli, 32nd degree, KCCH. He's the Assistant Grand Historian here at the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. I'm Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree, your channel host. Don't forget, subscribe, thumbs up, and as we release this video on the day of President Carter's funeral, regardless of which side of the political aisle you are on, you have to say that President Carter really did his best to serve our country throughout the whole of his life. So if you're thinking of President Carter today, maybe go out and do something for your community as well. That's what Masons do after all. So subscribe and then go do something good for your community. We'll catch you next time.